How do we, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about what happens in the human brain, particularly a woman's brain. When you suddenly stop contacting her, this isn't a game. It's not manipulation. It's neuroscience. It's behavioral psychology. And if we ignore that, we misunderstand everything about connection, intimacy, and how people actually respond when the dynamics of attention shift. The human brain is a prediction machine. Its primary role isn't just to think or to feel. It's to anticipate. It constantly builds internal models of the world so it can reduce uncertainty, predict outcomes, and conserve energy. This is not a philosophical idea. This is neuroscience. From the moment we wake up, the brain uses prior experiences, environmental cues, and learned behaviors to guess what's coming next. And when those guesses are correct, the brain rewards itself with a sense of stability. That's why routines feel comforting. That's why consistency feels safe. Predictability allows the nervous system to down-regulate, to relax, to feel in control. Now, take this principle and apply it to human connection, especially romantic or emotional relationships. When someone becomes a regular part of our lives, especially through frequent communication, the brain registers that person as a constant. When a man texts a woman every morning, calls her at night, checks in during the day, those actions form a predictable pattern. They create a rhythm the brain starts relying on. Her nervous system begins to expect your presence, your words, your attention. Over time, these micro patterns get woven into her perception of you. You're no longer just a person, you're a predictable event. But here's the twisting. Once the brain gets used to a pattern, it becomes efficient. The interaction becomes expected, even mundane. That doesn't mean it's not meaningful. It just means it's no longer stimulating the same neurochemical response. And this is where uncertainty enters the picture. Because when that regular contact suddenly stops, when the good morning texts vanish, when call silent, when the brain doesn't ignore it, it lights up. The prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making and social behavior, becomes more active. The anterogulate cortex, responsible for detecting errors and processing emotional pain, starts scanning what changed. Why? Was it something I said? Is something wrong? These aren't just emotional questions. They're cognitive responses to what prediction error. The model her brain built about you is suddenly inaccurate, and the brain doesn't like being wrong. This gap between expectation and reality creates discomfort. Sometimes subtle, sometimes intense, but regardless of the degree, it triggers a cognitive process called salience detection. In simple terms, her brain begins to assign more importance to your absence than it did to your presence. Why? Because now your lack of communication is unexpected, and anything unexpected draws focus. It's like when a familiar song suddenly skips a beat. You notice the silence more than you notice sound. This is the paradox of attention. We notice things most when they deviate from the norm. That's why silence after consistency speaks louder than words. It generates mental loops. She may begin checking her phone more often. She may replay your last messages, searching for clues. Even if she doesn't reach out, her mind might reach toward you. Because biologically, she's trying to resolve uncertainty. What's important to understand is that this reaction isn't about love, longing, or regret, at least not at first. It's about neural dissonance. Her brain is trying to close the gap between what it expected to happen and what's actually happening. That's why people often report thinking more about someone after communication stops. It's not because the person became more interesting overnight. It's because the mind is wired to focus on the unexpected. And here's where behavior starts to shift. Once you're no longer in direct contact, her brain shifts its strategy. Instead of passive reception, it becomes more active. It might start scanning social media, watching your stories, asking mutual friends. These behaviors aren't always conscious. They're driven by the brain's need to restore predictability, to either confirm that you're truly gone or to re-establish the pattern it had grown accustomed to. What's fascinating is that even if she doesn't act on these impulses externally, the internal activity increases. Emotionally, she may feel more curious, more cautious, or even frustrated, but psychologically, your absence becomes a focal point, not because of who you are inherently, but because of what your absence represents neurologically, an unresolved prediction, a question with no answer. This is why silence can be so powerful, not as a strategy, but as a phenomenon. It shifts the brain's attention from habitual comfort to active inquiry. And when that happens, people don't forget you. They analyze you. They revisit you in memory. They reconstruct you in imagination. And most importantly, they react, whether you see it or not. In the end, the human brain's need for predictability and its powerful reaction to unpredictability drives far more of our emotional and relational behavior than we often realize. And that means sometimes not doing something can create a louder signal than any words ever could. Dopamine is one of the most misunderstood neurochemicals in the human brain. It's often labeled as the pleasure chemical, but that's a simplification. In truth, dopamine isn't primarily about pleasure. It's about motivation, pursuit, and anticipation. It's the reason we chase goals, seek rewards, and keep going even when the reward isn't guaranteed. The dopamine system activates when we think something good is about to happen, not necessarily when it does. This distinction is crucial when we talk about attraction, communication, and especially what happens when you pull away from someone emotionally or physically. When a man is in regular contact with a woman, texting, calling, making plans, her brain starts to associate those moments with dopamine release. Not because she's in love, but because each interaction becomes a cue that a reward is coming. Maybe it's attention, maybe it's validation, or maybe it's just the familiarity of your voice. Over time, her dopamine system gets conditioned. Your name on her phone, the sound of your message alert, the way you show up consistently. All of these become dopaminergic triggers. They initiate anticipation. The brain starts to release dopamine even before the actual message is read, simply because the reward is expected. Now, think about what happens when you suddenly stop contacting her. From a biochemical standpoint, this is experienced as withdrawal. It's not just an emotional absence. It's a neurochemical disruption. The dopamine spikes that her brain had linked to your presence no longer occur. But because the system is conditioned, it doesn't stop looking for the hit. It starts scanning. She may find herself checking her phone more frequently, scrolling back through old conversations, or wondering when the next message will come. These behaviors are attempts to restore the dopamine loop that's been broken. This dynamic mirrors what we see in other areas of human behavior. Addiction researchers have long known that it's not the drug or the reward itself that hooks people. It's the anticipation of the reward. It's why slot machines are so effective. The uncertainty, the not knowing, keeps the dopamine system fired up. And in relationships, especially in the early or unstable stages, the same pattern applies. When communication becomes inconsistent or is withdrawn altogether, the uncertainty triggers the brain's motivational circuitry even more. So that's why your silence can sometimes feel louder than your words. It's not that she suddenly values you more, it's that her brain, specifically her dopamine system, is responding to the unexpected absence of a stimulus it had been trained to anticipate. This is powerful. It creates a sense of urgency, not because of who you are inherently, but because of what your withdrawal represents chemically, a disruption in the feedback loop. However, this doesn't always result in positive feelings. In fact, withdrawal from a dopamine source can lead to frustration, anxiety, or even anger. The brain is trying to restore a pattern and doesn't like being denied what it's come to expect. This is why some women might lash out, become passive-aggressive, or act distant when a man pulls back. It's not always because of deep emotional pain. It's a reaction to the abrupt dopamine deficit. Interestingly, this entire system was designed for survival. In evolutionary terms, the dopamine system helped our ancestors food, explore environments, and pursue mates. It rewards us seeking behavior more than you having. And in the modern world, it plays out in everything from dating apps to texting patterns. The person who gives just enough attention to stimulate anticipation, but not so much that it becomes routine, activates the dopamine system most effectively. This isn't about manipulation. It's simply how the brain works. But there's a deeper layer to consider. If your presence becomes predictable, the brain adapts. It begins to tune out the stimulus, just like it tunes out background noise. But if your presence becomes intermittent or is suddenly withdrawn, the brain reprioritizes you as a subject of interest. It starts to pay more attention precisely because it doesn't know what to expect anymore. The dopamine system loves novelty and unpredictability, especially when it's emotionally charged. In essence, withdrawal of contact isn't just about space or silence. It's a shift in neurochemical momentum. It moves you from being part of her daily routine to being a source of cognitive and emotional friction. That friction activates the dopamine system. And that activation creates behavior, whether it's checking your social media, reaching out, or thinking about you more than she wants to. Understanding this doesn't mean you use it as a tactic. It means you realize that human behavior, especially in relationships, isn't random. It's driven by deep, hardwired systems that respond to patterns, breaks in patterns, and the chemistry of anticipation. When you pull back, it's not just absence. It's the removal of a predicted reward. And the brain, being the highly adaptive machine it is, doesn't just let that go. It reacts, pursues, it seeks to understand. That's the power of withdrawal. Human beings are deeply social creatures, and much of our behavior is shaped not just by what we consciously think or feel, but by what we unconsciously observe and internalize from others. One of the most fascinating mechanisms that explain this social attunement is the mirror neuron system. Mirror neurons are a class of brain cells that fire not only when we perform an action, but also when we observe someone else performing that same action. This means that the brain is constantly simulating other people's experiences, almost as if they were our own. And this simulation doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It shapes how we feel, how we respond, and how we connect. In the context of relationships, mirror neurons play a foundational role. When you spend time with someone regularly, especially in emotionally charged or intimate ways, your brain begins to mirror their patterns. Facial expressions, tone of voice, even posture. Over time, this builds unconscious familiarity, a kind of neurological blueprint of the other person. You're not just getting to know them emotionally, you're wiring their presence into your nervous system. This is why certain people can make us feel instantly calm, while others can trigger anxiety. It's not magic, it's the brain's mirror system doing what it was built to dog, simulate, and reflect. Now, let's imagine a scenario where a man stops contacting a woman after a period of consistent interaction. What happens to her brain? On the surface, it might just seem like a break in communication, but internally, a different process begins. The mirror neurons that once activated every time she read his message, heard his voice, or remembered something he said, don't immediately shut off. In fact, they stay active, sometimes even more so. She begins to mentally simulate his presence. She hears his voice in her head. She replays moments, mimics imagined conversations, and recalls shared experiences with emotional clarity. Her brain is continuing the interaction, even in his absence. This mental simulation is not simply memory. It's an embodied response. Her nervous system is responding to the emotional imprint he left behind. This is why someone can still feel present even when they're physically gone. The mirror neuron system has internalized their patterns, and those patterns don't disappear just because the messages stop. They echo in the brain, creating a feedback loop that keeps the emotional connection alive longer than most people realize. What makes this particularly powerful is how the mirror system influences empathy. When a woman has bonded with a man through frequent interaction, her brain has mirrored his emotional expressions over time. So when he withdraws, her mind doesn't just register the silence, it feels it. Not intellectually, but viscerally. This is often why emotional pain from social disconnection feels so real. The mirror system is built on physical and emotional resonance. And when that resonance is disrupted, it can feel like a part of her own system is suddenly out of sync. In some cases, the absence of contact may even intensify her mental simulation of him. Because the brain seeks closure and completion, it starts filling in the gaps. She might imagine what he's doing, who he's with, or what he's thinking. This isn't always rooted in reality, but the brain isn't concerned with truth in these moments. It's concerned with ecoherency. It wants the story to make sense. And so it uses the mirror system to recreate the missing person as best as it can. It guesses his emotional state, his motivations, his reactions. All of this happens without him saying a word. This simulation becomes particularly strong if the connection was emotionally charged. That's because the brain prioritizes emotional experiences when it comes to memory and simulation. The more intense the interaction, the more vivid the mirror response. That's why casual acquaintances fade quickly, but emotionally significant people linger, sometimes long after they're gone. It's important to understand that this process is not something she chooses. It's automatic. It's the brain doing what evolution trained it to do: create social bonds, reflect shared experiences, and maintain emotional continuity. The mirror neuron system ensures that our connections don't vanish the moment someone walks away. They persist, replaying in thought, feeling, and memory, often with striking realism. In practical terms, this means that when you stop contacting her, your presence doesn't vanish. Instead, it shifts from external interaction to internal simulation. Her brain continues to engage with the pattern you left behind. She may not respond outwardly. She may even act indifferent. But if the bond was meaningful, if there was emotional intensity, her mirror system is still active, mirroring you even in your absence. When someone who once played a consistent role in our daily experience suddenly goes silent, the brain doesn't just acknowledge their absence. It starts working overtime to make sense of it. This is known as cognitive reevaluation. It's not just about missing someone. It's about the mind's need to reprocess the entire dynamic that was once familiar and predictable. The human brain is constantly updating its internal model of reality based on new input. And when that input stops, especially in relationships, it creates a void that demands explanation. That's when reflection deepens and mental recalibration begins. In the early stages of connection, people rarely take a step back to truly assess the quality or meaning of the relationship. The dopamine system is active, anticipation is high, and attention is focused on what's happening moment to moment. But when the stimulation stops, when the messages don't come, the calls fade, the presence disappears. The brain finally gets a chance to evaluate what it had been immersed in. Without the continuous feedback of the relationship, the mind begins to shift from experience to analysis. This reevaluation doesn't happen in one clean, rational sweep. It's layered. It begins with questions why did he stop reaching out? Did I do something wrong? Was I misreading things? These aren't just emotional reactions. They are part of the mind's natural investigative process. The brain, in the absence of answers, starts generating hypotheses. It sifts through memories, tone shifts, patterns in conversation, small emotional cues. All of it gets re-examined, often in greater detail than when the interaction was active. One of the most interesting aspects of this process is how memory changes in the absence of new experiences. Emotional memories aren't static. They are reconstructed every time they're recalled. So when someone disappears from our lives, we don't just remember them. We reshape those memories based on how we feel now. If her emotional state is hurt or confused, she may begin to reframe even the positive moments as misleading. On the other hand, if she's feeling nostalgic, she might idealize the connection, overlooking red flags or signs of distance. Either way, the person is being reinterpreted, not based on what they're doing now, but based on how their absence makes her feel. This is a crucial point. Absence doesn't just create space, it creates a mirror. When you stop contacting her, you force her to see the connection in a new light. And often that new light is clearer than the one that existed during the interaction. With no new data coming in, the brain can step back and ask, what was this really? Was he as present as I thought he was? Did he actually value me, or was I projecting that onto him? These reflections can be uncomfortable, but they are necessary for psychological clarity. The absence also shifts the focus from you to a her. When someone is constantly present, especially in romantic dynamics, much of the attention is outward. She's thinking about what you're doing, how you feel, how to respond to you. But when you're no longer reaching out, that external loop breaks and the attention turns inward. She begins to think about her own needs, values, and boundaries. Sometimes she realizes she was overextending. Other times she realizes she deeply valued the connection more than she thought. Either way, clarity comes not because of words exchanged, but because of silence held. What's particularly powerful about this shift is that it often reveals emotional truths that were previously hidden by habit. Routine contact can create a false sense of security or even distraction. But silence requires processing. It demands interpretation. And this often results in a deeper understanding of both the person and the dynamic. In some cases, that understanding leads to closure. In others, it leads to renewed interest and a desire to reconnect, but it's never neutral. Cognitive re-evaluation ensures that when you stop showing up, you still have an impact, just in a different dimension of the mind. Absence, then, is not the end of attention. It's a trigger for deeper thought. It's a space in which meaning gets reshaped. And ironically, it's in the moments where you're no longer communicating that your presence may be most intensely examined. Not through conversation, but through memory, emotion, and internal dialogue. The silence becomes its own form of communication, and the brain, needing resolution, begins the hard but honest work of reevaluation. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, describes the ways people emotionally bond and connect with others, particularly in close relationships. These bonds are shaped early in life and tend to influence how we behave in our adult relationships. Attachment styles, which are typically categorized into 4 primary types. Secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, describe the different ways individuals respond to intimacy, emotional closeness, and emotional withdrawal. When someone stops contacting another person, these attachment styles become particularly activated. The absence of contact, whether it's sudden or gradual, often triggers underlying patterns of attachment that have been set in place long before the current relationship began. For someone with a secure attachment style, the response to someone pulling away is often more measured and self-assured. A secure person is comfortable with intimacy and able to maintain a healthy level of independence. They trust others and believe that relationships are generally stable. If contact stops or someone becomes distant, A securely attached person might reflect on the situation, but is less likely to be overwhelmed by anxiety or fear. They may not immediately jump to negative conclusions, and they are capable of acknowledging that relationships sometimes experience periods of distance or miscommunication without taking it personally. They may even feel secure enough to allow the space, knowing that they can communicate their needs openly when the time is right. However, for individuals with an anxious attachment style, the absence of contact is experienced much more intensely. Anxiously attached individuals have a deep fear of abandonment and crave constant validation from their partners. When someone stops reaching out, they begin to experience significant emotional turmoil. Their brain's primary focus shifts toward why the person has withdrawn and what it might mean for the future of the relationship. The anxious person might overanalyze the situation, looking for signs that the person is losing interest or has found someone else. Their attachment system becomes hyperactive, and they may struggle with feelings of insecurity, doubt, and a sense of urgency to reestablish contact. This often leads to behaviors such as repeated texting or calling, even when they might not want to appear overly needy. In extreme cases, their fear of abandonment can cause them to act in ways that unintentionally push the other person even further away, but these behaviors are typically driven by a deep-seated emotional fear of rejection. On the opposite side of the spectrum is the avoidant attachment style. Avoidantly attached individuals often have a deep fear of intimacy and may feel suffocated or overwhelmed by emotional closeness. They tend to value their independence and may downplay or dismiss the importance of emotional connection in relationships. When someone stops contacting them, their first instinct may be to retreat even further, rather than reaching out or trying to resolve the situation. The withdrawal may actually align with their internal belief that they are better off on their own without needing to rely on others. This emotional distancing can serve as a defense mechanism, preventing them from feeling vulnerable. The absence of contact, in a sense, may not trigger as much emotional turmoil as it would for someone with an anxious attachment style. Instead, it may reinforce their belief that independence is key to their emotional stability. However, it's important to note that avoidant individuals are often unaware of how their distancing behaviors can negatively impact others. Their emotional shutdown in the face of absence is typically a learned response to avoid feeling too dependent or too close to others. Lastly, for those with a disorganized attachment style, the reaction to absence can be deeply confusing and chaotic. Disorganized attachment often develops as a result of inconsistent or traumatic caregiving in childhood, leading to a mix of anxiety and avoidance. These individuals crave emotional connection, but they are also deeply afraid of it. Their brains are often caught in a cycle of wanting closeness, but simultaneously fearing it. When someone stops contacting them, they might feel both devastated and angry, experiencing an emotional roller coaster as they try to reconcile their desire for connection with their fear of being hurt or abandoned. This confusion can lead to erratic behaviors. Sometimes they might desperately reach out, while other times they might pull away completely in an effort to protect themselves from further emotional pain. The push-pull dynamic that often characterizes their relationships can be especially amplified when the absence is not explained or resolved. Their attachment system is in constant conflict, and without clear communication or reassurance, they can find it difficult to process their feelings in a healthy way. These attachment styles become particularly pronounced when someone withdraws from the relationship, regardless of whether the intent is conscious or not. The withdrawal serves as a trigger, forcing individuals to confront their underlying emotional patterns and their fears of abandonment or intimacy. As a result, individuals with anxious attachment may become hypervigilant and overly dependent. Those with avoidant attachment may shut down emotionally or withdraw further, and those with disorganized attachment may oscillate between wanting closeness and pushing others away in confusion. Ultimately, the absence of contact provides an opportunity for people to confront the deeply ingrained attachment patterns that shape their responses to intimacy, closeness, and emotional distance. It can serve as a mirror reflecting how we view ourselves, others, and our ability to maintain healthy emotional connections. Whether the response is one of insecurity, withdrawal, or emotional costs, the activation of these attachment styles can shed light on the internal dynamics that govern how we relate to others, how we manage emotional closeness, how we navigate the complexities of connection and disconnection in our relationships. Human behavior is deeply influenced by how we perceive the value of others and, in turn, how we perceive our own value in relationships. This perception affects just our actions, but also the way we emotionally engage with others, especially when it comes to romantic or interpersonal connections. When we start to perceive that someone or something has a higher value, either due to their perceived rarity, significance, or how they fit into our needs, our behaviors towards them begin to shift. This shift, particularly when there's a sudden change in the perceived value of someone, can drastically alter how we communicate, interact, and even think about them. One of the fundamental ways our behavior shifts based on perceived value is through the level of effort we invest. When we place high value on someone, how do we, whether because of their attention, their attractiveness, or the emotional fulfillment they provide, we naturally invest more effort into maintaining the connection. This might manifest in consistent communication, taking extra care in our interactions, or being more emotionally available. In a romantic relationship, for instance, if a man perceives a woman as having high value, he might go out of his way to impress her, show her attention, or make plans with her to maintain and enhance the connection. The perceived value heightens his desire to preserve the bond, which prompts him to ways that display commitment, attention, and reliability. However, this behavior can shift significantly when the value of the other person is perceived as diminishing. When the perceived value of someone begins to decrease, whether due to their lack of responsiveness, withdrawal, or other external factors, the level of investment also decreases. This can be an unconscious shift where the person starts to act more distant, less engaged, or less eager to maintain the connection. For if a woman notices that the man she's dating is becoming less attentive, she may start to mirror this shift by texting less frequently, engaging less emotionally, or even withdrawing in an attempt to protect her own emotional investment. The value she perceives in the relationship decreases, and so her effort follows suit. This cycle is often not a conscious choice, but a natural response to how we emotionally adjust to our environment and our perception of what we're getting in return. This behavioral shift isn't just about active engagement, it also affects emotional proximity. We tend to keep people close who we view as highly valuable. Emotionally, physically, or even socially, when we perceive someone's value as high, we let them into our lives in ways we wouldn't allow someone we don't regard as highly. The closeness and access we give them reflect how much we value the connection and the potential benefits it brings. However, dopamine, when the value diminishes in our eyes, whether it's because of a perceived lack of interest, lack of effort, or a change in circumstances, we naturally begin to distance ourselves emotionally. We stop sharing personal details, we hesitate to invest time, and we guard our emotions. In romantic relationships, this shift often leads to less intimacy, fewer shared moments, and a reduction in meaningful conversations. Without consciously acknowledging it, the emotional distance reflects how much we evaluated the person's value in our lives. Our perceptions of value also impact our behavior in terms of exclusivity and availability. People who we consider highly valuable tend to have an exclusive spot in our lives. When we view someone as a high-value person, we often place them at the top of our mental and emotional hierarchy. We prioritize them over other interactions and are more likely to drop what we're doing to make time for them. This is why we often feel more compelled to respond to messages or make room for people we value. In contrast, when someone's perceived value drops, we don't feel the same urgency to respond, nor do we prioritize their needs as highly. We may become less flexible with our time and energy, consciously or unconsciously reserving it for things or people that we feel are more deserving of it. These behavioral shifts also influence how we interpret the actions of others. When we value someone, we tend to attribute their positive behaviors to their intrinsic qualities like kindness, love, or genuine interest. We are more likely to make excuses for their flaws or overlook small transgressions. But as the perceived value drops, we begin to reinterpret their actions more critically. Small acts of inconsistency, once overlooked, become magnified. If a woman perceives a man as having high value and he cancels plans, she may understand that he's busy and rationalize it. However, if his value drops in her eyes, she may interpret the cancellation as a lack of interest or disregard, leading to frustration or disappointment. This shift in perception creates a cycle of behavioral change in both individuals involved, where misunderstandings become more likely and the emotional connection continues to erode. Another significant shift occurs in how we perceive ourselves in relation to others based on their value. When we feel that the person we're engaging with sees us as valuable or desirable, we tend to feel more confident and secure in the relationship. We may be more willing to open up and express vulnerability. On the other hand, when we sense that the other person no longer views us highly, it can trigger feelings of inadequacy, insecurity, and self-doubt. These feelings often lead to behavior that mirrors the insecurity we're experiencing, such as withdrawal, defensiveness, or even overcompensation. This can create a cycle where both parties start acting in ways that further increase the perceived value of the connection, reinforcing the emotional distance and discomfort between them. Perceived value, then, is not just a cognitive process. It is deeply embedded in behavior. The way we treat others, the effort we put in, the emotional closeness we maintain and the time we give all shift according to how we assess the value someone brings to our lives. These shifts are not always conscious or deliberate, but they are a natural response to the inner calibration of how we perceive the worth of someone in our emotional landscape. And as these behaviors shift, so does the connection itself, often without either party realizing the full extent of the underlying changes.